So you may know that this is a program that I generally give for the 8th graders. Now, this is not the same program. This is a more expanded version of the 8th grade program. The program for the 8th graders, we try to keep it to within a half an hour, 40 minutes, depending on how much time they have. But 40 minutes is pretty long for them to do a program. Got my pointer? Okay. So, the Battle of Gettysburg lasted 3 days, and it covered a large area. And depending on where you think the battle was fought and where it wasn't, it's something like, 20 square miles. I generally tell people that the battlefield is about 5 miles long and 4 miles across, like a giant rectangle. And the town of Gettysburg is kind of in the northern center of that rectangle. In the 3 days of fighting, there were about 160,000 men involved. And there were something around 50,000 casualties. And, sometimes you see 51,000 casualties. The other day I saw somebody put 51,116. It's an estimate. So I always say, if you're estimating, why would you estimate 51,000 and not just 50? And there's all kinds of complications in the casualty figure. I should mention that sometimes men are wounded and are also captured, and sometimes are counted twice, But one interesting thing about it is that when you read books about the battle or general, popular history about the battle, oftentimes people say 50,000 men were killed. And when I say often, I mean a lot. It's one of the biggest mistakes you see out there. And really, 50,000, that means 50,000 men were killed, or they were wounded in the battle, and they survived, or they were captured. Now, some of those captured men might die in prison camp, or they're just missing, meaning they're unaccounted for. And, later some of those men might reemerge because they realize that, hey, those missing were captured, or those missing, fled for a couple of days, and they came back to the unit, unaccounted for. Now, some of those missing ended up not returning and were dead. This is especially a problem in the Southern Army because they retreat after the battle and have no idea what happened to the men that are unaccounted for. Maybe they're buried in unknown graves. So, and that also leads to the idea that we're not sure how many men were killed, because how do we deal with that missing figure, And because the southern states of America, the Confederacy, ceases to exist at the end of the war, there's no tally or readjustment of the figures after the war. So the missing are just simply always going to be listed as missing. And it's really difficult to figure that out. So I just like to point out that, just keep your ears open when you hear somebody say there are 50,000 men killed in the battle. It usually happens in the ghost tours. If you pay too much attention to when you're downtown and a ghost tour walks by, and they'll say 50,000 men were killed. One of my favorite things about it is, and I hear this a lot from people giving tours of the battlefield who are not guides. You hear this a lot, like on Little Round Top. And people are fond of saying, more Americans died in the 3 days of Gettysburg than the entire Vietnam War, which is just ridiculous. Like in the Vietnam War, 58,000 men died as a result. And Gettysburg, maybe 5,000, killed in the battle. Another 5,000 die in the hospitals around the town and as a result of the battle. So the real figure's 58,000 to 10,000. And then, it's apples and oranges. If we're talking about casualties, there are hundreds of thousands of casualties in the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, you get wounded, your chance of survival is much better than in the American Civil War. So you hear that a lot, though, and it's just not not true. But most of the cause of the wounds or death at Gettysburg is bullets. And I'll get our volunteers to hand around some bullets. And I do this with the 8th graders because, the teachers would like there to be some math involved in the discussion of history. So, what I always tell people, for the sake of argument, let's say that there were 150,000 men involved in the battle. 150,000. And let's say that each soldier on average fired a cartridge box. And we know that some of the units fired multiple cartridge boxes. Often the soldiers had a cartridge box and they also had ammunition in their pockets going into the battle. And then at some point they were resupplied. But for the sake of argument, let's say that every soldier on average fired 50 bullets. What is 50 times 150,000? You guys are close, but you got to put another 0 on it. 7,500,000. So how about if I tell you that I believe that 8 to 10 million bullets were fired in the Battle of Gettysburg? Do you think there's bullets still out there laying around the battlefield? I have found bullets on the battlefield. Now, technically, you're not allowed to pick them up, if they're on park property. But what's really interesting about it is our town, our economy since the time of the Civil War is based upon people going out and picking up those bullets and selling them to tourists. That's basically how we made our money after the battle. And we have a never-ending supply of bullets. They were everywhere. And they're still out there. You can still find bullets. There's lots of property that's private property around the town that you can find bullets in. When I was a kid, I had a metal detector. It's funny that I had a metal detector when I was a kid. I found bullets and stuff. Now I know exactly where I should be looking, and I have no interest in digging the little holes in the ground. I have no interest in it at all. So a little bit about the aftermath of the battle to start the program. As I stated, we're not sure how many men were killed at the battle, and it really depends upon how you count. But killed in action, men who were killed instantly and their bodies are laying on the battlefield, it's probably, between 3,000 and 5,000. So after the battle's over, there could be 5,000 bodies just laying on the battlefield. Now, a lot of men died a day after the battle. A lot of men died 2 days after the battle, 3 days after the battle. Men died a week after the battle. Men were taken to hospitals. In the town, they were taken to hospitals in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Harrisburg, Chambersburg, all along the retreat route for the Southern Army. And men died days and weeks after the battle. I generally tell people that about 10,000 men were killed or died as a result of the battle. And of course, that's taking into consideration the missing figure. Sometimes people will tell you 7,328 men were killed at the battle. And you see these ridiculous numbers that people give, specific numbers. But again, these are all estimates. And particularly the Southern Army didn't really keep good track of what happened to the people who weren't present for duty. All they're concerned with is how many men show up the next day, not whether this guy is wounded in the hospital and is going to die, or this guy is missing and he probably is dead, I don't know, just as an exercise, next time you're out there, stop by Armistead's marker on Confederate Avenue, the brigade marker for Armistead's brigade, and it says on it that they had 1,650 men present for duty. And it says that 88 men were killed. So Armistead's brigade only had 88 men killed. But then it says 460 wounded and 640 missing. You think some of those missing might be dead? So these figures that we're working with are not that good. So again, I would say, and you know what I also noticed, it's really interesting? If you die 4 months later in a hospital in Gettysburg, you're usually counted on the death list. But if you die 3 weeks later in Philadelphia, you don't make it onto the killed in action list or the killed list. I think that's interesting. You died later. So it's really confusing to say it, bluntly. But it took a whole week to bury the bodies. We have a great account from a New York newspaper that it's July 10th, and they're just starting to bury the bodies in front of Little Round Top in Devil's Den. So a week after the battle. And, some of these areas are rocky, and they have to get the bodies out of the rocks and take them to a field. Let's say you're at Devil's Den. What field are we talking about burying the guys in? What happens if you take them 100 yards and you dig 10, or you dig a foot in the ground? What happens? There's rocks. So you can bet that the guys buried, especially on the southern end of the battlefield that's rocky, aren't buried very deep anyway. And their bodies, every time it rains, their bodies are washing up, and there's all kinds of horrible scenes on the battlefield. Initially, everyone was buried all over the battlefield wherever they fell. And it wasn't until years later that they dug up the southern bodies and removed them to southern cemeteries. But starting in October, 3 months after the battle, burial crews went out and they dug the bodies up and started to reinter them into our national cemetery. And the burial operations in the cemetery, and of course, Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address on November 19th. They started in October and went into May of 1864. And so at the time Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, I think a little over 1,000 soldiers were actually buried in the cemetery. They were in the process of moving soldiers in. And you might know this. Originally, the dedication ceremony was supposed to be a consecration ceremony, meaning they consecrate the ground before there were any burials. But because Edward Everett, the keynote speaker, had such a busy schedule, he couldn't make it early in October, so they decided to push it to November 19th, and they dedicated the cemetery with some of the soldiers in it, but not all of the soldiers in it. And he continued to put them into the cemetery until the next year. And, we're fortunate to have this remarkable photograph taken in February of 1864. Samuel Weaver is the superintendent of burials. You like his beard? Yeah. And Basil Biggs is one of the men in charge of a crew that goes out on the battlefield and digs up the bodies and puts them in coffins and then takes them to the cemetery. And this photograph here comes to us from the Biggs family. So, and I kind of think it's him, but we're not sure. It doesn't identify which one is Basil Biggs. You can tell Samuel Weaver because his beard. What a cool beard. Now, this is Hanover, Pennsylvania, and undoubtedly, these are men who were killed in cavalry action on June 30th, 1863. And what's really interesting about it is this photograph is taken by Peter Weaver, Samuel's son, who owns a photographic studio in Hanover. And that explains how the photograph and why it's taken. But it's really the only photograph of the burial operations that we have. Oh, wrong button. It should work. Okay, got it. So we have a couple photographs by Samuel Fisher Corliss of Philadelphia, who came to Gettysburg in the fall of 1863, probably in November, around the time of the dedication ceremony. We don't know, maybe he's here for the dedication ceremony, but he took photographs, including this one, which shows soldiers being buried in one of the plots. I think it's interesting. You can see the soldiers are buried in a straight line, and today the the stones are in a semicircle. So the stones actually sit on top of the graves of the soldiers, or kind of. I'm sure they didn't move the soldiers when they put the semicircular plot stones in. And obviously, right away, there's headboards. There's not stones until later. But you can see that the headboards were nailed to the coffin and put onto the coffins, or put on the side. So you probably know this. Officially, there are no Southerners buried in our cemetery. It's a cemetery for Northern soldiers. Now, we know that they made some mistakes, and there's at least 8 Confederate soldiers buried in the National Cemetery. And we have access to the muster rolls of all the units that fought here, and we have lists of many of the dead, even from the Southern side, so we can compare the names of the soldiers with the names on the stones in the cemetery. And we know, like, there's a guy from the 11th Mississippi, Company K, 11th Mississippi, buried as a man from Company K, 11th Massachusetts. And it's obvious that that's a mistake. And you can see how Mississippi and Massachusetts might get mixed up on a headboard where somebody's writing in pencil. Maybe it just was M-A-S-S and M-I-S-S. It got mixed up. But for the most part, the Southern soldiers were buried in unknown graves all around the battlefield, and pits and trenches, and not individual graves. They weren't marked, they weren't noted. And it wasn't until 8 years later that ladies from the South pulled together some money, ended up hiring a local crew, and tried to recover bodies from the battlefield. Some of those bodies were taken to Richmond. There's some in North Carolina and Georgia and South Carolina. There are basically 4 places where they moved the bodies to. And thousands of bodies were removed from the Gettysburg battlefield. Now, of course, this was 8 to 10 years later. Do you think they could find all the bodies 8 to 10 years later? No. And we know that they didn't get them all. I attended a wonderful lecture by Kathy George, who was the park historian years ago, and she did some research on this very topic, and her estimate was that if you add up how many Southerners we think were killed in the battle and buried around the town. Now, this is difficult because, again, remember, some of the Southerners, they retreated and they died in Fairfield, and they died in Chambersburg, and they died in Mercersburg, or they made it all the way back to Virginia and they died. And many are reported as missing, and we're not sure how many of the missing are killed. But if you add them up and you come up with an estimate, and then we know the number of bodies that were moved south after the war, that there seems to be like a difference of 1,000 that are unaccounted for. So in her estimation, there are hundreds of bodies buried around the battlefield, and it could be as many as 1,000. And, her logic when she was giving her discussion just, it made a lot of sense to me. And I would agree with that. What if you lived here after the battle? Would you plow your field? I like to ask the 8th graders questions like that. So it probably is not going to come to a shock, or it's not going to be shocking to you to find out that we have article after article after article in our local newspaper about people in the area finding skeletons on the battlefield in the years following the Civil War. So from the time that the burial operation ceased to the present day, I have like 50 different times in the newspaper that I found articles from, and I have collected them. There's a guy here, Randy Miller, who works with us. He's obsessed with this. He's really created a big file on this. So we collect these articles. And of course, if you knew Greg Coco, he was really into this, and he collected articles about bodies found. So I think we have like 50 of them or so. And if you count up the bodies, because sometimes there's 1 or 2 or 7 or 20 found at one time, it's over 200 bodies that have been found on our battlefield from the time of the Civil War to, last found in 1996. So 200. So if 200 have been found, how many do you think are still out there and haven't been found? And so that just gives you an idea of the process that we're using to figure these things out. And let me just tell you, today, no one is looking for skeletons. The Park Service has never even attempted to look for skeletons. We don't run ground penetrating radar across. We don't look for them. We're not looking to find them. And I guess if you ask the park, why aren't you concerned about the bodies? They would say, well, it's hollowed ground, and the whole battlefield is a cemetery for the soldiers that fought here. Okay, so I'd imagine that would be their official explanation. So in our newspaper, we have repeated articles about this. So here is a good example. In 1887, Frederick Peffer found 7 soldiers from Mississippi because they had Mississippi buttons and on them, and he found them in front of the 12th New Jersey monument near the Bryan farm. And so this drawing was done by someone that Eric Dorr had hired. Eric Dorr, this is his great-grandfather. And you might know, at the Gettysburg Museum of History on Baltimore Street, he has the artifacts that were found along with the skeletons on display, and you can go see them. So, and according to the article, and there's a couple articles about it. Oh no, I shouldn't say this. According to Eric's granddad, after they dug up the skeletons, they reburied them on the other side of the Bryan barn. So, and here's another example. I only put a couple in here because I don't want to drag it out too long. But here, this was in 1881. Mr. William H. Gelback was plowing his place near the Emmitsburg Road. To give you an idea, the Gelback place is the Johns Farm, and it's behind the Wax Museum parking lot. So it's on Johns Avenue. And do you know there's a historic house or an older house back there? I think it's built in 1872, off the top of my head. But basically, we're talking about the area he's plowing is like McDonald's, somewhere around there. And he found the bones of about 20 men he dug up. Now, here's the interesting thing to me. He had them placed in the corner of the field. So even in all these articles, when they find skeletons, they don't remove them and take them somewhere. No, they just rebury them at the same place a little bit deeper. So these 200 I'm talking about that were found, most of them were found and then reburied at the same spot, so they're still there. So, and then here, I think this is 1917, but 2 more bodies were found on the same farm. The Johns farm, which was the Gelback farm. I think it even says it used to be the Gelback place. And of course, this could be anywhere from General Pickett's up, like I say, near the Wax Museum. We're talking about these bodies are found. I prefer to think of it as under McDonald's. But, so even when the bodies are found, they're just reburied. And, you know, like I said, I don't want to drag it out. But my favorite articles are where the bodies are found in town. Like this one is on West High Street, where there was a church and there was a graveyard there, and they found a body, Union soldier. And this one on West Middle Street, Mrs. Musselman's house, and they're talking about this buried there. And here's this was found on the lot of Levi Mumper. I know exactly where this body was found, and I stop there often and look at that spot. And they say it was a Georgia officer that was buried there after the battle in town. And of course, here's one found on the old golf course property, you know, the 300 yards southeast of the Springs Hotel. So, you know, we have these article after article about skeletons found, and you can actually visit, if it says, the spot where these skeletons were located. And so I guess one of the points I always like to make to people is there are still bodies buried all around the town and all around the battlefield. And we should keep that in mind when we bulldoze the battlefield, you know, without doing any archaeology. Always makes me angry. So one of the greatest examples of, you know, burials in private property is the Forney Farm out near the Peace Light. Of course, Iverson's North Carolina Brigade crossed an open field in the first day's fighting and was just decimated. And, you know, I think their brigade of 1,300, they lost, you know, 700 or 800 of their men, depending on how you count, killed, wounded, captured. And I think, according to one account afterwards, like 180 of them were buried in the field in front of the Eternal Light Peace Memorial on the south side of the Mummersburg Road in 2 large pits. And later, they referred to this area as Iverson's Pits. And John Forney, you know, he said in an interview with a North Carolina soldiers published around 1900 that he had farmhands that refused to go into that field, and he had trouble getting them to plow that field. Apparently, the ground moaned when they tried to plow it. And that was the only ghost story I ever heard in my entire life. Until recently. And again, I guess the problem that I have is it apparently takes 125 years for ghosts to materialize. Now they're everywhere. But John Forney said that even after they recovered bodies from his field, he didn't think they got all the bodies. How are you going to get all the bodies? How are you going to find them all? You know? And so that's probably a good candidate for bodies still being out there. Now, besides the fact that there's bodies all around the town and they had to bury them and, you know, the burial operations, there were wounded. Depending on how you count, because the Southern Army took a bunch of wounded with them, a lot of wounded are, you know, people report as wounded, but it's a slight wound. And they, you know, when both armies leave, they leave with the armies. Or there were wagons of wounded that the Southern Army took with them. You probably have read the account that one of the Southern wounded wagon trains is 17 miles long. And so, but just left behind. Perhaps there's 20,000 wounded soldiers left behind when both armies leave. And let's say there's 2,000 people living in the town and 1,000 people living in the farms around the town. So 3,000 people have to care for 20,000 wounded soldiers. How are they going to do that? It's a serious issue. And, you know, it's almost as if Gettysburg's like a natural disaster, like a hurricane hit or a tornado. And it was devastated, and the town needed supplies. And people brought supplies in. They did the best they could. You know, the Fonistock House on Baltimore Street became like a, you know, a relief center. Here's the sign for the United States Sanitary Commission. And supplies were brought in, by wagons and trains, and they were stored here and then put in other wagons and taken out to all the hospitals. At first, there were hospitals everywhere. And there were crude hospitals set up by the Army during the battle. Here is the 2nd Army Corps Hospital at Rock Creek. And basically, I always thought this photograph was off of Golden Road, if you know where that is. But maybe Sachs Road. Some people say that's John Burns. I don't know about that, but I think when you look at these photographs taken after the battle, every curmudgeon-y old man is John Burns. I will be John Burns one day, not too far away. So eventually, they consolidate the wounded soldiers. They set up a tent hospital east of the town, basically where the giant parking lot is. And this hospital consisted of 500 tents. Each tent had 12 men in it. And for months, there was a giant hospital in the fields east of the town. And local women went out to help care for the soldiers, as well as women that came in from other places, like, Baltimore and Philadelphia. The Patriotic Daughters of Lancaster, the Sisters of Charity from Emmitsburg. But, what happened when the soldier got shot in the leg? They amputated. Yeah. And, we have photographs that were taken at Camp Letterman General Hospital. And, of course, beside the wounded soldiers and the killed, there's the debris of battle. And that's the name of this particular program. So, and when we talk about the debris, there's an account. I meant to put it in my program. I haven't done it yet, but there's an article there's an article in the paper that appears right after the battle in a bunch of newspapers, and it claims that 28,000 muskets and pistols and arms of all sorts were picked up on the Gettysburg battlefield by the provost marshal afterwards. 28,000? And they give you a list of how many were still loaded when they found the guns and how many had been loaded multiple times on top of each other and not fired. But they pick up uniform items and swords and muskets, but they don't pick up other stuff. And some of the stuff just lays there until somebody figures out what to do with it. And one of those things is the horses. So we know there were 70,000 horses and donkeys and mules at the battle, nearabouts, by estimates. We're not sure how many were killed. When I was a kid, I heard people say 10,000 horses were killed in the battle. I often heard 5,000 horses were killed. I always wondered how they came with that figure, because no one's counting dead horses. It's not like they're accounted for in the official reports like the men who, and basically men are counted because they're on the payment rosters and they have to cross them out when they die so they don't pay them, But they were no one kept track of the horses. But what happens is after the battle's over, there's a provost marshal's report for the Union Army, a quartermaster department report, and they say that they need 2,500 horses to replace those that had been put out of service during the Gettysburg campaign. And so I think people have taken that number and just doubled it. Okay, the Union Army lost 2,500, the South lost 2,500. Okay, it's 5,000. But that number accounts for all the horses from the march to Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg, and the march back. And most of these horses are probably lost on the march, especially the march to Gettysburg. So when I look at the accounts of the horses on the battlefield afterwards, there's probably only a few hundred. Okay, so still, hundreds of bloating, rotting horses. Did you ever have like a groundhog in your backyard for a week or so? And we're talking about a horse and we're talking about hundreds of them, what must that smell like? And of course, this is the Trossel farm. I colorized that image, by the way. And 45 horses were killed in Catherine Trossel's front yard. And for more than a week, there were 45 rotting horses in July in her front yard. And it rained for a couple days after the battle, and then it was hot for a few days. What do you think that was like? So, of course, again, since this program is, part of it's for the 8th graders, what do you do with, hundreds of dead horses? They put them into piles and they lit them on fire. What do you think the town smells like with giant piles of burning horses? Much better, don't you think? When I decided to do this program, I knew that somewhere I had seen a drawing of burning horses. This is like from Harper's Weekly, one of those booklets that's published afterwards, and it's Shiloh where they're burning horses. We don't have a burning horse photograph from Gettysburg or, drawing, but there's one from Shiloh. Here is a Gettysburg drawing, though, and this is Edwin Forbes on July 4th, 1863. Look at that. So he drew this the day after the battle. I think that's crazy. And again, this is for the 8th graders. Every horse had a name. Oh, and you know how they get horses into a pile? Live horses have to drag their dead buddies into the pile. Yeah, the 8th graders just hate this part of it. So we're not making up the stuff about the burning horses. We have accounts that talk about it. Here's a great newspaper article about it I found not too long ago. We pity the villagers for the terrible stench that will soon be upon them. They're talking about the partially burned, rotting horses. And this Benson Lossing account just amazes me. During our ride within the Union lines, we saw the remains of not less than 200 of these noble brutes, many of them on fire, the smoke of which, with the effluvium of decomposition everywhere, filled the whole region of Gettysburg with unpleasant odors. When's the last time you have used that word in a sentence? Effluvium. I want you to find a reason to use that. Effluvium. And then, Sarah Broadhead's diary. Every breath we draw is made ugly by the stench. And here, of course, is a famous photograph of the Leicester House, Meade's headquarters, and I colorized it, taken on July 8th or 10th, somewhere around there. It's not dated. And look in the road. This is the 20-town road. And there's dead horses in the middle of the road like a week after the battle. You see the wagons riding around them. Can we drag the dead horse out of the middle of the road? And that tells me a lot about the horrible situation around town and what, everybody has issues. And then, can you imagine the destruction of the natural scenery of our area? We talked about a hurricane or a tornado. All the trees, 8 to 10 million bullets. I get a kick out of, some of you may know, I don't like the witness tree sites. I think it's ridiculous. And honestly, most every tree in the area died within a few years after the battle. And we might have trees that grew up afterwards, but there are very few trees that were here during the battle. And I think when I was growing up, people talked about a dozen at the most, not hundreds. And it's because of all the bullets flying everywhere. This photograph from Culp's Hill is taken in 1867, so 4 years after the battle. And look, all the trees are dying, and trees have fallen over. But do you know who doesn't mind bullets in the trees after the battle? the local townspeople. Because if you lived here, your house was a hospital, your animals were killed, your crops were destroyed, and your field is a graveyard. And there is no compensation by the federal government for the damages to your property. You're basically going to lose your farm. So how are you going to make money? And you know what we have a lot of? Visitors. People are coming to Gettysburg and they want to see where the great battle was fought. And what do they need when they come here? They need a place to stay. They need some food. They need to have a tour guide take them around and show them where the battle was fought. And they need to buy battlefield souvenirs. So we're going to go out on the battlefield. We can go out on our own property and gather up bullets and take wood, take trees, cut them up, and make things out of them to sell to the visitors. And so the tourist industry is born immediately after the battle is over. And, you got to admire the people who live here for just finding another way to make money besides, if they're a farmer. And here's an 1869 image, and it's at the Springs Hotel, and it's kids selling artillery shells, a bayonet, bullets to visitors as they're coming in. I just think that's awesome. And of course, besides bullets, there's artillery fragments, girls. So let's hand out some artillery fragments. And you probably know that there are different kinds of artillery fragments. There are rifled shells, there are cannonballs. And these cannonballs can be a solid shot, like a big old round bowling ball. They can be an explosive shell. It has a fuse in it. You see in this cutaway. And it has iron balls in it, or steel bearings, like a ball bearing. And when the fuse is lit after it fires, it explodes, and pieces of shell and shrapnel fly in different directions. And according to Henry Hunt, who is the chief of artillery for the Northern Army fired 569 tons of ammunition during the Battle of Gettysburg. And according to, the canister, for instance. Let's do a mathematical problem for you again. So canister, and I think we got some canister rounds being handed out. Canister is a tin can. It's basically used at short range, like a giant shotgun shell. Out of the Napoleon, a canister round holds 27 iron balls. So if you see, we're handing out a canister round. And they're a little bit heavier than you might imagine. So when you fire it, the tin rips apart and it just blasts across the open field. And most of the time, they would depress the cannon barrel so it's firing into the ground in front of the troops you're aiming for. So the balls hit the ground and bounce in different directions and spread out a little bit farther. And when the enemy got closer, you could fire 2 tin cans at the same time. It was called double canister. And that would have a devastating effect on the troops attacking your position. So let's say in Pickett's charge, we have 100 northern cannons lined up from Little Round Top to Cemetery Hill. Let's say there's 100. We think there's probably 90. But let's say there's 100. And let's say they're all firing double canister at the same time. So what's 100 times 50? 5,000. A good cannon crew can reload and fire the cannon 3 times in a minute. So in 1 minute, we can throw 15,000 canister rounds across the open field at Pickett's division and the rest, Pickett's charge. How many men are in Pickett's charge? Like 12, okay. They say 15, but it's really 12,000, something like that. So here's the point. If one ball hits every person, we can take out the entire charge in 1 minute. Besides the fact that there's a rifle fire and that we're firing at them for 20 minutes. Can you imagine the amount of these canister rounds that were laying out in the fields along the Emmitsburg Road after the battle was over? And again, everybody wants to buy a canister round, don't you think? Oh, should I mention that perhaps we have some artillery shrapnel and some bullets for sale in our gift shop downstairs? Did you know that? Okay, well, check that out. You get the idea, though. Everybody wants to buy an artillery shell, but there's a problem. Their artillery shells are live rounds. And so there's accidents after the battle, mostly with children. So let's say that you're parents and you have some children and you need some money. Are you going to send your children out to find artillery shells and then take them to the train station and sell them to visitors? Oh, but no one wants to buy a live artillery shell. The kids are going to have to get the fuse out and take the powder out of the shell before they can sell it. Well, that doesn't work out too well. And so the worst thing I can show you here about this, there's an article in November of 1863, and we'll get our artillery. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take the artillery shell round, and you can feel a live explosive artillery shell if you like. Be very careful. I want you to see how heavy it is. It's heavier than you think it's going to be. Okay, that's an actual shell found in Fairfield along the route of retreat of the Southern Army during the battle. And it was fired by a Union artillery position near Fairfield. We even know the artillery battery that must have fired the round. But don't worry, it's been defused. It's not live shell anymore. But here is an article in the paper where a guy named Russell Briggs from Philadelphia came to Gettysburg. His son was in the 72nd Pennsylvania, was killed in the battle at the Angle. And he came to recover his son's body. And while he was here, he listened to Abraham Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address. The next day, he went on the battlefield and he found a shell. And he undertook to unload it. He had the cap taken out and was striking the shell upon a stone to loosen the powder. That's how you get the powder out. You bang it against a stone, right? When you were kids, does anybody ever have a cap gun? And you take the little red strip and you hit rocks on the cap. I used to do that all the time. So you get the idea what happens. So he was banging it when a kid in our town named Alan Frazier came running around the corner and yelled for him to stop. And just then, the shell bursted. I like that, bursted. Alan Frazier was standing beside Mr. Briggs. A fragment striking him in the abdomen cut him nearly in two, causing his death in a few minutes. And today, you can visit Alan Frazier's grave in Evergreen Cemetery, a victim of this exploding shell after the battle. And that's not the only time that it happened. There's lots of sad stories in our newspapers. And here's the worst I could tell you. Edward McPherson Woods, son of Alexander Woods, he lived on Chambersburg Street in the second block. And the family was huddled in the cellar during the fighting. And on July 5th, they opened up the cellar door and the kids went out in the backyard to play. And a kid picked up a rifle and shot and killed his 3-year-old brother. And you can visit Edward McPherson Wood's grave. It's behind the Methodist Church on Middle Street. So 3 years old, killed on July 5th, 1863. And it's, like I said, it's not the only time it happened. I like Mr. James Call, who was 16 years old at the time, I believe. The deceased had opened a number of shells without accident. That's right, he got really good at it until he wasn't good at it. And it exploded and he was killed. And he's buried in Evergreen Cemetery, and you can visit his grave. But shells sell really well. So people continue to get the shells and sell them. Joel Danner, his father was Joel Danner, but they called him Bert. He actually opened up a museum on Baltimore Street, free battlefield museum. In our town, the term battlefield museum means relic shop, and you can buy stuff from us. I love the concept you have a museum, but you sell stuff. And honestly, some of the relic shops in town today, I go into them and it's like a museum to me. Every time you go in, there's something different in there and you're like, wow. It is kind of like a museum. And so we've had those early on in our town. So the people who lived here, you don't have to take your stuff down to the train station and wait for somebody to buy it. You just take it to Danner. He'll buy it from you and he'll sell it for you. Of course, he'll add some bucks onto it. But he was a distributor of battlefield artifacts found around the town. And we're fortunate to have a couple of images from the inside of his museum/store. And you can see the stuff he had on display. Look at this. So let me get this straight. You take an explosive artillery shell, you get all the powder out of it, then you fill it with kerosene or lamp oil, and you're lighting it on fire. That doesn't sound safe to me. How about the artillery shell alarm clock? That'll wake you up, won't it? And these relic sets, there was a guy named Good and a guy named Woodward. I think this is a Woodward. We always know it's a Woodward because of the pattern on the front. These guys in town, they made these things and they sold them. Woodward's stuff, if you want to check it out, he carved Gettysburg in an artillery shell, piece of tombstone from the cemetery, a piece of canister round, some bullets, a button, an eagle. You can find this on eBay. For fun, go on eBay and look for Woodward Gettysburg souvenir set, something like that. And these things sell for sometimes $1,000, $2,000 each. I knew a guy who collected them. He had 40 of them. Now, I wanted them for our museum too. I don't know if I'll ever get them. We have some. This is from our museum. And John Good made them. And you see, John Good, look at this. He opened up a warehouse on Middle Street. It no longer stands, but it was out Middle Street, kind of, let's see, what was it across from? It's out near almost the Seminary Ridge on the left-hand side. But there he is on his wagon, and he made rocking chairs out of battlefield wood, preferably with a bullet sticking out of it. Wouldn't that be cool? And he made battlefield relics. He had a lathe, fancy turning. He had a lathe. The Battlefield Novelty Works. And here he is at his little souvenir stand on West Middle Street. I was lucky to find this little advertisement. You can't really see what it is. And then here, this is from a postcard, is another person selling souvenirs and relics in front of the Eagle Hotel. So locals, were very creative, especially during the reunions. And then, of course, I wanted to point out this, girls, the most famous battlefield souvenir ever in our town. And I have two of them here. These are my personal Jenny Wade dough trays. I have the largest collection of Jenny Wade dough trays in existence. It's an actual replica of the dough tray that Jenny was using when she was killed. And look on the bottom of it, because it tells you that. You don't want to buy one if it's a fake. You have to buy the actual replica. And you can find these on eBay. So I don't know if anybody has a phone real quick. Could you put in Jenny Wade dough tray and see how much they're selling for? They sell between $5 and maybe $40. So they don't sell for much. The most I ever paid for one, I think, was $28. How much? $29.99. There you go. There you go. She's got one. So, and do you know, I have no idea how many of these were made and sold in our town. But they sold them at the Jenny Wade House gift shop starting in maybe the 1910s. And you know, by 1920, they were everywhere. And you can I guarantee you can find one today downtown in one of the shops if you want. Maybe the Antique Center on Baltimore Street has a few. And of course, you know, since we're talking about Jenny Wade, why was she baking bread for the soldiers during the battle? Because she needed the dough. It just never gets old, does it? So we have John Rosensteel, and you can see what I like about, of all the things in this photograph I really like the fact that he's wearing his battlefield tour guide badge. I don't have my badge on, but I have a badge, you know. I'm badge number 57. You know, we each have a number, and then you can research who number 57 was before you and who had it. Yeah. But John D. Rosensteel. Now, I think he's not originally from Gettysburg. He's from like Emmitsburg. But he came here immediately after the battle and found artifacts on the battlefield and collected them. And this is that musket that he supposedly, I always question, I don't know why I question the story. He says he found it near Devil's Den. And it's a Confederate sharpshooter rifle. And this is actually the beams from the Cobean farm in the first day's battle. I actually put this in my farms book because the story's so interesting. And that was lodged in their spring house between the beams after the battle. And you can see some of the other artifacts he created or collected. Now, he opened up a museum in 1886 near Little Round Top. And it was on the Wheatfield Road at the base of Little Round Top. And it was, he had a restaurant. Later, they actually had behind it, a roller skating rink. And this was a museum for many years. The building stood well into the 80s. I'm thinking like it stood until like 86. I remember the building there. But it had long since closed down. Of course, it was his nephew in 1921 that opened up a museum on Cemetery Hill across from the entrance of the National Cemetery. And that was the Rosensteel Museum that most of us remember. In the years from 1921 to 1970s, there were 14 different additions placed onto the museum. So it started as a small place, and it just kept growing. And of course, it was starting in 1939, the home of the electric map. And this is George D. Rosensteel, and he's the nephew of John Rosensteel that started the Rosensteel Museum on Round Top. And I'm sure some of you remember that. So I think off the top of my head, the Park Service bought it in 71, and they really didn't take it over until like 74, I think. And then eventually they, took all the exhibits out and changed it around. But the collection that the National Park Service has today in its visitor center is basically the collection from the Rosensteels that was in that museum originally. And, I should mention, you can still see the electric map It's owned by a man in Hanover. He has it put together. And if you look, he does have a Facebook site, and he does advertise days when you can go over and see the electric map in downtown Hanover. Or you can call him up, and if you have a group of friends, I don't know exactly how much he charges, but he'll do a special showing of the electric map for you and your friends if you like. And I've had people that have, done that, called him up and gone to see it. So you can still see the electric map, although it's not part of the Gettysburg National Military Park anymore. Now, early on, there was a need for commercialization to assist the tourists that were coming into the area. And the people who lived here wanted to make the area as attractive as possible to visitors from the outside. But really, the big thing that happened was in 1884, the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad was placed. And when that thing came to Gettysburg, all of a sudden, locomotive service started coming into the town, and it really, really expanded our tourist base. And by the 1880s, I think, this is 1885, according to the caption, there on Cemetery Hill, we have a tower. The tower is built in 1878, and it's built for tourists. You pay admission, you climb up in the tower, and you look over the battlefield. And you could stay in one of our really nice motel rooms. And also, veterans encampments occurred here, and you can see they had a souvenir shop. You can buy battlefield souvenirs. You can hire one of these responsible locals to take you in a carriage around the battlefield and give you a tour. So the tourist industry by the 1880s was well established. Also, I should mention, because sometimes this is left, sometimes when people talk about the program like I'm doing, they just pick on the local people. But it was the local people who established the battlefield itself. Local people got together, and here's John Schick that owned the store in the center of the town at the time of the battle. He said he smoked 21 cigars on the first day of the battle. He was so nervous. Look at these white hats. Aren't they awesome? I like his hat. But William D. Holtzworth, he was a veteran of the Civil War that lived in Gettysburg and became one of our more prominent battlefield tour guides. And Robert Horner, that's Charles Horner, I think, who was a doctor in the town. I think it's Nicholas Wilson, who was a veteran of the Civil War. And of course, John Batchelder, government historian. And don't ask me what to deal with the bald-headed kids. I don't know. But, David Beeler had just died. He was the editor of our local newspaper. But it was local men that founded the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. And in 1863, they purchased Little Round Top and Cemetery Hill and started purchasing other ground. And they're the ones that first preserved the ground where the battle was fought so they could convert it into a park. And of course, that eventually blossomed into the Gettysburg National Military Park. And, monuments were dedicated early on. This is the Soldiers National Memorial in our National Cemetery. And you can see that General Meade, the Northern Army commander, is a keynote speaker in 1869 when it was established. And by the 1880s, there are hundreds of monuments and markers and tablets on our battlefield. And imagine this, that there's a monument dedication. And the veterans that fought at the battle come back to dedicate their monument. In this case, this is the 155th Pennsylvania on Little Round Top. They're from Allegheny County. This is the Keystone Zouaves. Now, not only did the veterans come, but they brought their families with them. They brought all the families with them of the men who had served in this unit but died during the war. And because they're all from the same towns, like the whole town sends people out to Gettysburg to help dedicate the monument. So here's a William Tipton photograph of the dedication ceremony of the veterans. How many people do you think are standing behind the camera? There could be 1,000 people at each of these dedication ceremonies of each of these monuments. And of course, these people came into town by train and are staying here for a few days. So they need a place to stay, they need a place to eat, and they need to buy battlefield souvenirs. Don't you think? And of course, I can tell you right now that there's people behind the camera selling souvenirs. How do I know that? Do you see? Now, in the photograph, just keep in mind, this photograph is 1886. And these guys are in their 50s. They're not in their 80s or 90s. But what do they all have in their hands? Canes. You see the canes? Where did they get those canes? I wonder. Our town sells canes, preferably made out of battlefield wood with a bullet sticking out of it. And some of them are very elaborate. I should have turned this a little bit. This is one that's on display downstairs in our museum, has Jenny Wade's picture on it. That's what I would want, Jenny Wade on my cane. But this is an 1880 photograph, and here's a 1900 photograph. So, you know, kids who grew up in our town learned to make stuff to sell to visitors. And I just think it's fascinating. And of course, we talked about hotels. The Springs Hotel opened up in 1869 and had hundreds of rooms. It has a long wing that goes back off the center of it. It even has an observatory on top of it to look out around across the first day's battlefield. It was where the country club property is, you know, behind like, what's that, the Gettysburg Day Spa is there now. But it's not enough to just have people come to see the battlefield. We have to have something else. So we have the Catalysine Springs. That's right. We have a medicinal spring, and you can come there and, you know, you can drink the water that has magical medicinal properties to it. The story is that after the battle, wounded soldiers went over to the spring. They were washing their arms and leg wounds off, and they realized that the water was healing their wounds. So you drink the water, and it cures you. Here's General Meade. You know, I think he died 2 years later. Yeah, not 2 days, but 2 years later. Yeah, not long after this. And of course, we bottle the water and we sell it. Here it's being sold at Danner's store. So here, buy a cannonball. Oh, here, buy medicinal water from the spring. So we're really, you know, tourists love this stuff. I love this. You see at the end? The Museum of Rare Relics and Curiosities. Yeah, love the curiosities part. I wonder what that is. So here's the Battlefield Hotel. And you can see at the bottom here, chicken and waffles. You got to have chicken. That's the Jenny Wade house. So this is like in the intersection of the Baltimore Pike and Emmitsburg Road. And we have locals that are tour guides. Charles Gilbert was a member of Company K, fought in the battle. And then he was given tours out of the Keystone Hotel. Ziegler and Holtzworth, livery stable. So tour guides, you know, they would partner with hotels. They would get livery stables, and they would take people around the battlefield in carriages and charge them. And of course, you know, by 1915, there were so many people giving tours, they licensed the battlefield guides. You might know Jim Tate was a guide for 67 years. And of course, I'm a licensed battlefield guide. When I became a guide, all the postmen in the town were guides. The minister at the Presbyterian Church was a guide. The mayor of the town was a guide. All the school teachers were guides at the school. Everybody was a tour guide. Now, now there's a lot of tour guides that aren't from here that live other places. But at one point, everybody who lived here, they were all the tour guides. And of course, there are many ways to tour the battlefield over the years. Here at the end, I'm going to show you a few. You could take a tour of the battlefield on the Gettysburg Electric Railway. The trolley existed from 1896 to 1916 and would take thousands of visitors around the battlefield. And of course, they charge money for it. Here's on your ticket, the back of it had a map. And it would kind of go out through the town and down the Emmitsburg Road and around Devil's Den and Little Round Top, where it would join up with the Gettysburg-Harrisburg Railroad and come back along into town. And then, it was a big circuit. And sometimes they ran 6 or 8 trolleys at one time on the tracks and had sidings. On busy days, thousands of people rode on the trolley. In the 1920s, there was an airplane tour of the battlefield. Doesn't that sound awesome? You took off from an airstrip that you can still see, kind of, in front of the Eternal Light Peace Memorial. And it rode you down. It was like a 15-minute ride. It rode around over Devil's Den, Little Round Top, Powers Hill, Culp's Hill, and back to the airport. It cost $3 in 1927. Again, this was a time when not many people had ever flown, so it was an adventure as well. Then, of course, starting in 1959, we had the battlefield tour bus. And I don't know if people knew, but initially it was a little Volkswagen, van. And then eventually they started to use like a school bus. And of course, this is on Baltimore Street. You know what I like about this photograph? I think the Holiday Inn is under construction. So that means it's 1964. 1964. And eventually they used a double-decker tour bus. In the 1970s, they came up with that. And those things have been around for a while. They're the same buses, basically. They keep fixing them up. Do you ever behind one of them? They run by propane, and if you're behind one, you smell it. You're like, wow, what's that smell? When I was a kid, all the rage was the helicopter tour of the battlefield. Now, I never rode in a helicopter, but it did come by me one day when I was on the Round Top as a kid. That makes a lot of noise. Mr. Voss ran the helicopter tour. And then, of course, you could tour the part of the battlefield by train. We had the Gettysburg Scenic Railroad. Do you know that they're opening the railroad back up? And starting next year, we think it's going to be like May or June, the railroad again, the Scenic Railroad will pass by our building. And perhaps, maybe I wrote the script for the railroad. So, kind of partial to that. And I just wanted to point out some, do you remember the History Nerds van? I mean, people are always trying to make money from the battlefield. I should mention that it's not always locals. Like the Springs Hotel was outsiders. The trolley was outsiders. People from other places saying, hey, we can make money there, and coming and building something to make money from the tourist-based industry. The History Nerd van, they had initial van and then it didn't work out too well in the end. It got hit, and turns out that they weren't insured and they went out of business quickly. I always like to show that. I remember that day. And I don't know if you know, this is Wes Ayers' enterprise. He bought some buses from Yellowstone. I think this was a 1939 white touring coach that took people from the train station to the hotel, and he got a few of them and ran people around the battlefield in it. And there's always been tour tapes. There's been tour guides, but there's always been, since it became popular in the 1960s, audio tours of the battlefield. And I remember initially they gave you like a tape recorder and you carried around your car. and you listen to the tour tape. My favorite was the one with Walter Cronkite as a narrator. Have you ever heard that? I think I have it here in my tape collection. He's a great narrator. And then, of course, the Tower. The Tower was here from 1974 until 2000. And, growing up and coming here, even before I lived here, coming here and seeing this stuff, what is the appropriate level of tourism and what is, absolute just taking money from tourists for no good reason? I think our town has always struggled with the appropriate level of commercialization and memorialization, and sometimes maybe we cross the line, maybe when we tell jokes about Jenny Wade, things like that. But, and it's really tough. And, I talk to people and, I'm going to tell you that ghost tours are out of control, that's too much. But other people, might not think that way. Was the Tower too much, charging $8 a person for people to ride up a 380 feet elevator to get to a tower to look out over the battlefield? I don't know. Who am I to say? Is a Stuckey's at the Peach Orchard just too much? Right in the middle of the battlefield, like where the monuments are located? Eisenhower was one of the people who was responsible for helping get Stuckey's removed. And Mamie was really upset because pecan pie was her favorite. But, I had to say this. When I was young, like in the 70s, and I'd say the late 60s, early 70s, tourism was at its height. There were motels up and down the Emmitsburg Road. And Gettysburg was just like a giant amusement park. And maybe that was too much. But now, a lot of that commercialism is removed. Now I have fond memories of all the commercialization, but you can still tour the battlefield in different ways. And, the moped is now a motorized bicycle. You can rent them and tour the battlefield, or there's a horseback tour of the battlefield, or you can go with Charlie Fennell on the Segway tour, or the Scoot Coupe. Have you seen the Scoot Coupes? I don't know why, but the Scoot Coupe seems wrong to me. It's basically a glorified bumper car. And when I'm driving through the square and they're coming, I see them, I have the desire to run them off the road. I don't know. It's just something about it. But you probably read in the paper, every once in a while there's an accident with the Scoot Coupes. It just doesn't seem safe. And then, of course, we have the ghost tours. What can I say about that? That I'm not fond of the ghost tours. But to me, I would just say the ghost tours is the latest way that the people in our community have found to make money from the tourists. So it's just a natural progression almost. But every once in a while I see something that's just a little bit unsettling to me. And sometimes I don't know why something bothers me. And I don't know if it's really wrong or I'm just, again, I'm telling jokes about Jenny Wade. I mean, what could be wrong worse than that? So I want to thank everybody for coming to the program, and I hope you had a good time.